Welcome back to Deathly Curious Australia, where the past refuses to rest. I'm Monique, and today we're opening our very first true crime file. These episodes are going to be a little different to my paranormal investigations. Okay, so there are already some incredible creators covering true crime, and I wanted to spend a little time thinking about what I wanted these episodes to be. For me, it isn't about trying to solve a case or creating drama where there isn't any. It's about understanding what happened, following the evidence, and remembering the people at the centre of the story with the respect they deserve. Whenever we're dealing with an unsolved case, there will always be rumours, theories, and opinions. I'll do my best to separate those from what's actually supported by evidence. If something is a fact, I'll tell you. If something is uncertain, I'll tell you that too. And if I share a personal thought or reaction, I'll make it clear that's exactly what it is. Before we begin, I also want to give you a content warning. Today's episode discusses the murders of 2 teenage girls. While I won't be focusing on graphic detail, there are references to violence that some listeners may find upsetting. Please take care while listening. The case we're looking at today has remained unsolved for more than 60 years. It's one of Australia's most well-known cold cases. Over the decades, there have been countless newspaper articles, books, documentaries, and theories about what happened. But before we open the police file, I'd like us to do something else first. I'd like you to meet Marianne Schmidt and Christine Sharrock, because long before they became part of an unsolved murder investigation, they were simply 2 teenage girls enjoying their summer holidays. And I think that's where the story deserves to begin. As I was researching this episode, I kept coming back to one thought. True crime often introduces us to people at the worst moment of their lives. We learn how they died before we ever learned who they were. I don't want Marianne and Christine to be remembered only because of what happened to them. I'd like us to spend a little time getting to know them first. Marianne Schmidt was 15 years old. She had emigrated from West Germany with her family in 1958 as part of the post-war migration to Australia. They eventually settled in West Ryde, where they began building a new life. Only a few months before the events at Wanda Beach, Marianne's father died after a long illness. Reading about that really stopped me for a moment. At 15, most of us are thinking about school, friends, and what we're doing on the weekend. Marianne was helping her mother care for 4 younger brothers and sisters while her family tried to adjust to such a huge loss. You don't often see that side mentioned, but I think it tells you something about the sort of person she was. More than 60 years later, her younger brother Hans still speaks about Marianne with so much warmth, not as a victim, as his big sister, the one who looked after him, the one who should still be here. Next door lived Christine Sharrock. Christine was also 15. She'd lost her father when she was only 4 years old and later chose to live with her grandparents, Jim and Jeanette Tagg. When the Sharrock and Schmidt families became neighbours, Marianne and Christine quickly became close friends. People who knew Christine described her as gentle and quiet, someone who was happy just spending time with the people she cared about. As I read about the 2 girls, they sounded exactly like so many teenagers. They laughed together. They made plans together. They were looking forward to a day at the beach. Nothing about that sounds unusual. That's exactly why this story has stayed with so many Australians. It didn't begin with anything extraordinary. It began with two friends doing something thousands of teenagers had done before them. Looking back now, it's easy to forget that. We know how the story ends. They didn't. For Marianne and Christine, Monday, the 11th of January, 1965, was just another day of the school holidays. They couldn't have known that morning would be the last time their families would see them. As I was putting this episode together, I also found myself thinking about the people they left behind. For Hans, Marianne wasn't part of a famous cold case. She was simply his sister. For Christine's grandparents, she was the granddaughter who never came home. Families don't stop missing someone because 60 years have passed. Birthdays still come around. Christmas still comes around. Life moves forward, but there's always someone who should have been there. Hans once said it would be nice if she was still around. It's such a simple sentence. When I first read it, I actually had to stop for a moment. Because after everything that's been written about this case over the last 6 decades, those words say more than anything else ever could. Before we talk about the investigation, I'd like us to remember that this isn't only a story about an unsolved crime. It's also the story of two girls who never had the chance to grow up. Let's go back to the summer of 1965, the day everything changed. Monday, the 11th of January 1965, was meant to be an ordinary day. The girls had originally planned to go to the beach the day before, but poor weather had changed those plans. Like so many teenagers on school holidays, they simply decided to try again the following day. That Monday morning, Marianne and Christine left home together, carrying their beach towels and swim gear. Their destination was Wanda Beach, part of Cronulla's long stretch of coastline in Sydney's south. In 1965, it was a popular place for families, surfers and teenagers making the most of the summer holidays. There was nothing about that morning to suggest it would become one of the darkest days in Australian criminal history. According to family members, the girls were expected home later that afternoon. It wasn't unusual for teenagers to travel independently. It was a different time. Parents placed a great deal of trust in their children, and a day at the beach with your best friend wouldn't have raised any concern. That detail is important because it's easy to look at this case through modern eyes. Today, many parents would think twice before allowing two 15-year-olds to spend the day unsupervised. In 1965, it was simply normal. The girls caught public transport to Cronulla before making their way towards Wanda Beach. At some point during the afternoon, their plans changed forever. Exactly what happened during those final hours remains unknown. No witnesses have ever been able to provide investigators with a complete account of the girls' movements after they arrived at the beach. That gap in the timeline has remained one of the greatest frustrations in this investigation. When Marianne and Christine failed to return home that evening, their families became worried. As the hours passed, concern quickly turned to fear. Both families contacted police and a search began. I think every parent can imagine that feeling. You tell yourself there's probably a simple explanation, right? Maybe they missed a train. Maybe they've gone to a friend's house. Maybe they'll walk through the front door any minute with an apology for making everyone worry. As each hour passes, those comforting explanations become harder to believe. By the following morning, the search had intensified. Police, volunteers, and local residents began combing the area around Wanda Beach. Then came the discovery no family ever wants to receive. On the morning of the 12th of January, the bodies of Marianne Schmidt and Christine Sharrock were found in the sand dunes behind Wanda Beach. They had been murdered. The news shocked Sydney. Violent crimes involving strangers were far less common than many people imagined, and the murder of two schoolgirls in broad daylight shattered the sense of safety that so many families had taken for granted. Almost immediately, detectives from New South Wales Police Homicide Squad were assigned to the case. They were facing enormous public pressure. The media demanded answers, the community wanted reassurance, and the two grieving families desperately needed to know what had taken their daughters. More than 60 years later, that question still hasn't been answered. As I worked through the original newspaper reports, something really stood out to me. The headlines focused on the brutality of the crime, the growing police investigation, and the hunt for whoever was responsible. That's understandable. But behind every headline were two families who had gone from expecting their daughters home for dinner to planning funerals. That reality can be easy to lose sight of when we're reading a case decades later. For Marianne and Christine's loved ones, this wasn't history, this was their life. And from this point on, the investigation became one of the biggest murder inquiries Australia had ever seen. News of the murders spread quickly. Within hours, Wanda Beach had become the centre of one of the largest murder investigations New South Wales had seen. Detectives from the homicide squad arrived at the scene alongside forensic officers, photographers, and uniformed police. The sand dunes were sealed off as investigators began the painstaking task of documenting every single possible piece of evidence they could find. It's easy to forget how different forensic science looked in 1965. There was no DNA profiling, no mobile phone records, no CCTV footage to retrace someone's movements. Investigators had to rely on witness statements, physical evidence, and good old-fashioned detective work. Every footprint mattered, every tyre track mattered. Every person who thought they'd seen something became important. Police worked quickly to establish a timeline. Who had seen the girls? When had they been last seen alive? Had anyone noticed a suspicious vehicle? Was there someone walking through the dunes who didn't belong there? Hundreds of people were interviewed during those first few days. Many really wanted to help. Others believed they had seen something significant, but couldn't be certain. As anyone who's ever witnessed an unexpected event knows, memory isn't perfect. People forget fragments, a face, a shirt, a car. The difficulty is working out which memories are connected to the investigation and which are simply ordinary moments that happen to occur on the same day. One thing investigators established fairly early was that the girls had been seen alive at Wanda Beach during the afternoon. Several witnesses recalled seeing two teenage girls matching Marianne and Christine's descriptions. Those sightings helped police narrow the time frame, but they still couldn't explain what happened after that. And then another witness came forward. His account would become one of the most discussed pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. A teenage boy told police that while walking through the sand dunes, he'd seen two girls talking with a man. At the time, nothing about the interaction seemed alarming. He had no reason to believe he was looking at the last known sighting of Marianne and Christine. Only after hearing the news the following day did he realise what he may have witnessed. According to his description, the man appeared to be in his 20s. He was described as being of solid build, with dark hair, and wearing casual clothing suitable for a warm summer's day. It wasn't much to go on, right? Even so, detectives treated the sighting seriously. If the witness had really seen Marianne and Christine, this unknown man instantly became someone police needed to identify. Unfortunately, despite extensive public appeals, no one has ever conclusively matched to that description. Over the years, countless people have been suggested. Some were investigated thoroughly. Others were little more than rumours that grew with time. That's something you'll hear me say throughout these true crime files. Just because a name appears in a newspaper, a documentary, or an online discussion doesn't make it evidence. One of the challenges with an unsolved case is that speculation has decades to grow. Stories are repeated until they sound like fact. Sometimes they're not. So, as we continue through this investigation, I'm going to stay with what detectives could actually establish. Because even after 60 years, separating fact from assumption is one of the most important parts of understanding this case. From the very beginning, police believed someone out there knew more than they were saying. The question was whether that person would ever come forward. As detectives continued building their timeline, information began arriving from every direction. Some people really believed they had seen something important. Others came forward after recognising a face in a newspaper or hearing conversations around Sydney. Every lead had to be checked. Some were dismissed quickly, others took investigators in completely new directions. One of the biggest challenges was working out which information could actually be relied upon. Memories change over time, especially after an event receives widespread media attention. It's human nature. Once photographs and descriptions are published, people can unintentionally begin connecting those details to memories they weren't completely certain about in the first place. That doesn't mean anyone was lying. It simply means eyewitness evidence is always needed to be treated carefully. As the investigation gathered momentum, police also began looking at whether the offender could have been someone familiar with the area. Wanda Beach wasn't an isolated stretch of coastline that only locals knew about. During summer, it attracted families, surfers, tourists, teenagers from all across Sydney. That made the investigation even more difficult. The person responsible could have lived nearby. They could just as easily have travelled to the area that day. Both possibilities remain open. Police also considered whether the girls had been deliberately targeted or whether they had simply crossed paths with the wrong person at the wrong time. More than 60 years later, investigators still haven't been able to answer that question with certainty. I found that particularly frustrating whilst researching this case. Usually as you work through an investigation, you start seeing a clearer picture. Here, the opposite happened. The more I read, the more I realised just how many questions remain unanswered. That can be uncomfortable. We naturally want a story to reach a conclusion. We want to know who was responsible and why. Sometimes investigations don't give us that ending. Sometimes all we can honestly say is that we don't know. I think it's important to be comfortable saying those words. There's nothing wrong with uncertainty when that's where the evidence leads. It's certainly better than filling the gaps with assumptions. As public interest continued to grow, newspapers followed every development. New names appeared, fresh theories were discussed. People began wondering whether this crime could be linked to other violent attacks that occurred around Sydney. Some of those possibilities would become major lines of inquiry. Others would eventually be ruled out. One in particular would attract attention for decades. And that's where our investigation turns next. Once the crime scene had been secured, detectives faced an enormous task. Looking back now, it's easy to forget how different a murder investigation was in 1965. There were no mobile phones to trace, no CCTV cameras capturing movements. DNA profiling was still decades away. Investigators had to build the case piece by piece, relying on witness accounts, physical evidence, and a lot of patient detective work. As I was researching this case, I kept thinking how different that must have felt compared to an investigation today. Now we almost expect technology to fill in the gaps. Back then, those gaps could remain empty unless someone came forward. The scale of the investigation grew quickly. And over the months that followed, police interviewed more than 7,000 people and followed thousands of leads. It became one of the largest homicide investigations New South Wales had seen. One thing detectives believed from the very beginning was that someone out there had seen something important. Wanda Beach wasn't deserted that day. It was the middle of the school holidays. Families were scattered across the sand, surfers were in the water, and people were moving through the dunes. Whoever was responsible hadn't committed this crime in complete isolation. The problem wasn't a lack of witnesses. The problem was knowing which observations actually mattered. Think about the last time you went to a busy beach or a shopping centre. Could you describe one person you passed? Probably not. Most of us don't pay attention to strangers unless something unusual happens. That's what detectives were up against. They weren't asking people to remember a suspicious event. They were asking them to remember an ordinary summer's day that only became significant later. Some witness accounts lined up remarkably well, others didn't. That's not unusual. Memory isn't a recording. It changes over time, and even honest witnesses can remember the same event differently. Rather than dismissing those differences, detectives had to work through them, looking for the details that appeared consistently. Those details would become the foundation of the investigation. The first people detectives spoke to were Marianne's younger brothers and sisters. They had spent the day with Marianne and Christine and were the last people known to be with them. The children told police that Marianne and Christine had gone to collect their bags from further along the beach. Nothing about the moment suggested they were in danger. There was no sign of panic, no indication that anything was wrong. The younger children simply waited for them to return, and they never did. That account gave detectives their last confirmed understanding of the girls' movements. After that, they had to rely on people who happened to be at Wanda Beach that afternoon. One witness became particularly important. A local firefighter named Dennis Dostine told police he'd seen Marianne and Christine at around 12:45 that afternoon while walking with his son. He remembered the girls because they appeared to be moving with purpose. At first glance, That might not sound like much, but in a major investigation, even a small observation can help narrow a timeline. Unfortunately, Dennis couldn't tell police where the girls were heading or whether they intended to meet someone. His sighting answered one question, but immediately raised another. Where were they going? As detectives continued interviewing people, some reports began to come in. Several people believed they'd seen Marianne and Christine later that afternoon. Some accounts overlapped, others couldn't be confirmed. That's one of the frustrations of an investigation like this. You don't receive one clear picture. You receive hundreds of small pieces, and it's up to detectives to work out which ones belong together. As detectives compared the growing number of witness statements, one detail kept appearing. Several people independently reported seeing Marianne and Christine with a teenage boy not long before they disappeared. No one knew who he was. No one could give police a name, but the descriptions were similar enough that detectives believed finding him was important. An identikit was prepared and released to the public. Police described the young man as being around 16 years old, slim, with fair hair. It's worth pausing here because this is one of those moments where history has quietly changed the story. If you read about the Wanda Beach murders today, you'll often see this boy described as a suspect. That's not what police said at the time. They wanted to identify him because they believed he might be able to explain the girls' movements that afternoon. Those are two very different things. Wanting to speak to someone doesn't automatically make them responsible for a crime. It's simply good investigative work. The identikit received widespread publicity. Newspapers published it. Police appealed for anyone who recognised the young man to come forward. Despite those efforts, the public record has never clearly established whether he was identified, whether he came forward, or whether detectives eventually satisfied themselves that he had no involvement. That's one of the many questions that still surrounds this case. As I was researching this episode, I found that surprisingly frustrating. It feels like such a simple question. Who was he? Yet more than 60 years later, there's still no clear public answer. Maybe detectives identified him and quietly crossed his name off the list. Maybe they never found him. Whatever happened, it wasn't something police publicly explained. That uncertainty has allowed plenty of speculation to grow over the years. Personally, I think it's important to resist the temptation to fill that gap ourselves. It's okay to say we don't know. Sometimes that's the most honest conclusion we can reach. At this stage of the investigation, detectives had interviewed thousands of people. They'd built a timeline of the girls' final known movements. They had appealed to the public for help identifying the young man seen with Marianne and Christine. And even with all that work, they still didn't know who had murdered the two girls. The investigation was far from over. In many ways, it was only beginning. One thing that really stood out to me while researching this case is how different it feels when you look at it through the eyes of detectives in 1965. Today we already know the names that have become linked with Wanda Beach. Christopher Wilder, Alan Bassett, Derek Percy. Those names didn't exist in the investigation back then. Detectives couldn't skip ahead. They followed one lead at a time without knowing where any of them would end. I think that's the best way for us to approach this part of the story as well. Not by asking who seems most likely with the benefit of hindsight. Instead, let's look at the people police examined and ask a much simpler question. Why did investigators take an interest in them? Sometimes the answer is straightforward. A person matched part of a witness description. Sometimes it was because of information uncovered years later. In other cases, detectives noticed similarities between this crime and offences committed elsewhere. None of those things prove guilt. They explain why someone's name appeared in the investigation. That's an important distinction. Real investigations don't begin with certainty. They begin with questions. Some of those questions lead somewhere, others don't. The Wanda Beach investigation followed exactly that path. And among all the names that have surfaced over the decades, one has attracted more attention than any other. Christopher Bernard Wilder. If you've read about the Wanda Beach murders before, there's a good chance you've come across that name, Christopher Wilder. He's probably the person most often linked to this case. But before we go any further, I think it's important to separate what we know from what has developed over time. Christopher Wilder wasn't considered a major person of interest in January 1965. His name became more prominent years later, as detectives learned more about his life and his offending. Wilder was born in Sydney in 1945. He spent part of his childhood overseas before eventually returning to Australia. By the mid-1960s, he was living in Sydney as a young man. On its own, that doesn't make him unusual. What drew investigators back to Wilder was everything that became known about him in the years that followed. Police established that he had a history of sexually motivated offences involving young women and teenage girls. They also knew he spent time around Sydney's beaches and had access to a car. None of those facts prove he was responsible for the Wanda Beach murders. They do explain why detectives believed he deserved closer attention. When retired Detective Inspector Ian Waterson reviewed the case as part of the New South Wales Police Cold Case Justice Project, he publicly said that Christopher Wilder stood out above the other people police had examined. That statement has been quoted many times, and I think it's worth looking at carefully. Waterson wasn't announcing that the case had been solved. He wasn't saying police had uncovered new forensic evidence linking Wilder to the murders. What he was saying was that after reviewing everything available, Wilder remained the person who concerned investigators the most. There's an important difference between those two ideas. As frustrating as it is, concern isn't the same as proof. And proof is what investigators need before anyone can be charged with a crime. That's why, despite all the attention Wilder has received over the years, the Wanda Beach murders officially remain unsolved. One thing I found interesting while researching this case is how easily public discussion can shift from possibility to certainty. The more often a name is repeated, the more people begin to assume the case has effectively been solved. It hasn't. Police have never charged Christopher Wilder with the murders of Marianne and Christine. No court has ever found him responsible. That's where the evidence stands today. I think it's important we leave it there, not because the questions aren't worth asking. They absolutely are. But because evidence should always take precedence over assumption. Christopher Wilder wasn't the only person detectives examined over the years. Like many major investigations, the Wanda Beach case produced a long list of people whose names were considered at different stages. Some attracted attention because of later crimes. Others came to police attention after new information emerged. One of those men was Alan Bassett. Bassett was already serving a life sentence for the murder of 19-year-old Carolyn Orphan when detectives began exploring whether he could be connected to Wanda Beach. Part of that interest centred on a landscape painting he'd given to a detective. Some investigators believed parts of the painting appeared to resemble features of the Wanda Beach crime scene. Others disagreed. It's one of those details that often gets repeated because it's unusual. Unusual doesn't necessarily mean significant. The painting has never been accepted as evidence that Bassett was involved in the murders. It was simply another avenue detectives chose to investigate. Years later, Bassett voluntarily provided a DNA sample. As far as the public record shows, that testing didn't result in charges relating to the Wanda Beach investigation. The inquiry continued. Another name that surfaced was Derek Percy. Percy was serving his sentence in Victoria for the murder of a child and over time became linked to several unsolved cases around Australia. In 2007, detectives questioned him about Wanda Beach after material recovered from one of his storage units prompted further inquiries. Again, it's important not to read too much into that. Being interviewed doesn't mean someone has been connected to a crime. It means investigators believe the information available at the time justified asking more questions. Percy was never charged with the murders of Marianne and Christine. Neither was Ivan Milat. His name has occasionally appeared in discussions about Wanda Beach because some people believed an old police identikit resembled a younger Milat. Police examined that possibility. After reviewing the available records, they were able to rule him out because he was in custody at the time of the murders. I actually think that's a useful reminder. Even decades later, detectives were still willing to revisit old theories. Some held up under scrutiny, others didn't. That's exactly how a good investigation should work. At the end of all of those inquiries, detectives found themselves back where they'd started. They had investigated countless leads. They had examined several people whose histories warranted closer attention. They still didn't have the evidence needed to identify the person responsible for killing Marianne Schmidt and Christine Sharrock. After looking at the people detectives examined over the years, it's natural to ask the next question. Why, after more than 6 decades, does this case remain unsolved? It's a fair question. Police interviewed thousands of people. The investigation has been reviewed multiple times. Forensic science has advanced enormously since 1965. So why are Marianne Schmidt and Christine Sharrock's murders still officially unsolved? The answer is frustrating. Suspicion isn't enough. Even if investigators believe someone deserves closer attention, they still need evidence that can stand up in court. That's the standard our justice system is built on. And although that can be incredibly difficult for families waiting for answers, it's also what protects innocent people from being wrongly accused. As I was researching this case, I kept coming back to that point. It's easy for us to read about a person of interest and think, well, that must have been him. Detectives can't work that way. They need evidence, not a feeling, not a theory, evidence. That's why this investigation is still open today. Not because police stopped looking, because they haven't yet been able to prove who was responsible. One thing that has changed dramatically since 1965 is forensic science. Evidence collected at crime scenes can now be examined using techniques investigators could never have imagined at the time. That offered renewed hope. During later reviews of the Wanda Beach investigation, police re-examined items collected from the original crime scene using modern forensic methods. Some results were encouraging, others weren't. In 2012, New South Wales Police announced that testing on a bloodstain recovered from one of the girls' clothing had identified a weak male DNA profile. It wasn't enough to identify a specific individual, but it was enough to show that evidence collected decades later could still hold information investigators hadn't been able to access in 1965. For the families, that announcement must have brought a mixture of hope and frustration. Hope because science was continuing to move forward. Frustration because hope isn't the same as an answer. Another difficulty investigators faced was the passage of time itself. During later reviews, detectives searched for biological material that had been recorded during the original investigation. Some of those exhibits were located, others couldn't be found. That struck me while I was researching this episode. Every piece of evidence matters in a cold case. If something has been lost over the decades, it's not just another missing exhibit, it's a missed opportunity. An opportunity that might never come again. Even so, police haven't closed the door on this investigation. The Wanda Beach murders remain an active cold case. Detectives continue to say they'll access new information as it becomes available and will continue using advances in forensic science whenever possible. To me, that's an important point. An unsolved case isn't necessarily a forgotten case. Sometimes it simply waits for the right piece of evidence, and sometimes that evidence arrives decades later. Before we finish, I'd like to share something personal about why this case has always stayed with me. When the Wanda Beach murders happened, my mum was around the same age as Marianne and Christine. She grew up in the Sutherland Shire, spent time at Wanda Beach and loved surfing. While I was researching this episode, I couldn't help thinking how easily our family could have been connected to this story in a very different way. Years ago, Mum told me about an experience she'd never forgotten. She was travelling to a job interview in Sydney when a man pulled over and asked where she was headed. After she explained where she was going, he told her he might be able to help her find work and offered her a lift. She accepted, and as they drove, she began feeling increasingly uncomfortable. She couldn't point to one specific thing. She just knew something didn't feel right. And trusting that instinct, she asked him to let her out, explaining she didn't want to be late for her interview. Thankfully, he did. Many years later, after watching a documentary about the Wanda Beach murders, Mum wondered whether the driver could have been Christopher Wilder. I want to be very clear here. There's no evidence that it was him. No one can say that it was. It's simply something Mum reflected on years later. Whether it was Christopher Wilder or a completely different man isn't really the point. What stayed with me was something else. How many women have trusted that quiet voice telling them something wasn't right? How many stories have never been told because nothing happened? Sometimes listening to your instincts is enough to change the course of a day. Sadly, Marianne and Christine never had that opportunity. After spending so much time with this case, I kept asking myself one question. What does an unsolved investigation really leave behind? For police, it leaves a file that's revisited whenever new evidence appears or technology improves. For forensic scientists, it leaves unanswered questions they hope one day they'll be able to answer. For families, it's different. It's birthdays, it's empty chairs, it's wondering what life may have looked like if one ordinary summer afternoon had unfolded differently. I don't think any of us can fully understand what that's like. What we can do is remember. We can resist the temptation to turn an unsolved case into a guessing game. We can accept that saying we don't know isn't a weakness. Sometimes it's simply the truth. And we can keep talking about Marianne Schmidt and Christine Sharrock as the young women they were, not only as victims. Marianne, Christine, more than 60 years have passed since you packed your towels and headed to Wanda Beach. Neither of you could have imagined that people would still be speaking your names all these years later. I hope this episode has done something your families have always done. I hope it's reminded people that you were far more than an unsolved case. You were sisters, granddaughters, friends, two teenagers. Two teenagers who should have had the chance to grow up. To Hans, to Christine's family, and to everyone who has carried this loss for more than 6 decades. Thank you for continuing to share Marianne and Christine with the rest of us. I hope one day you receive the answers you've been waiting for. Until then, Marianne, Christine, thank you for letting us remember you. When we opened this file, I said I wanted us to remember the 2 girls at the heart of this story. I hope we've done that, because before this became one of Australia's oldest unsolved murder investigations, it was simply 2 best friends looking forward to a day at the beach. I'm Monique. Thank you for joining me for the very first Deathly Curious True Crime File. Until next time, stay curious, because every unanswered question begins with curiosity. Every real answer begins with evidence.